Hi, I'm Ethan Hansen, and I'm a student at Cape Cod Community College. My research project is on the psychedelic renaissance, or in other words, I am looking at the explosion of new ideas and artistic expression that occurred in the 1960s as a direct result of Timothy Leary and LSD. At first, we need to look at the early research of LSD, and this brings us back to the year 1938 in Switzerland, when an ambitious chemist by the name of Albert Hofmann first synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide, which would later get the name LSD. Um, at the time, he did not know what he had just created, and LSD would sit on the shelf for the next 5 years until 1943, when the chemist would revisit the compound. During his experiment, he would get a little bit of it on his hand, making him feel strange, but it raised his curiosity. A few days later, on April 19th, 1943, he would take a substantially larger dose of the compound. Upon riding his bicycle home from the lab that day, the compound would begin to take a hold of him, and he would have what would go down in history as the first ever acid trip. Now, in the 1950s, LSD was used in a controlled setting. Scientists were curious to see if it could help treat things like anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. The government even got their hands on it and tried weaponizing LSD during the MK Ultra experiments when they tried turning it into a mind control substance, which they failed. In 1959, Timothy Leary would come to Harvard, where he would begin his short but electric career. Right upon starting that new job, he would team up with Richard Alpert, another psychologist, and the two of them would partner up for their shared fascination with consciousness and overall their hunger just to understand the mind. In the early 60s, Timothy Leary would have his first experience with psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. After having this experience, he quoted, "I learned more in that 6 hours than I have in my entire career prior to this as a psychologist," which was a very bold statement. The two immediately began the Harvard Psilocybin Project, along with Aldous Huxley, who is the author of The Doors of Perception. What they were doing is they were dosing themselves, their colleagues, and also graduate students. Now, this was obviously met with much resistance from Harvard, along with other students, as this scared people. It's a little unorthodox for the times. But they did have a lot of positive results, and the mass majority of their research, or rather their participants, claimed to have a life-changing experience after having this compound. When LSD came into the mix, it is reported that Timothy Leary did not speak for 3 days after first taking the compound. And on that fourth day, the first thing that came out of his mouth was, "Wow." Both Leary and Albert knew that they were onto something big. Unfortunately, their experiments would come to an end officially come to an end at Harvard in 1963 after Albert was caught administering LSD, or not LSD, he was caught administering psilocybin to an undergraduate student off campus, which was a huge no-no. The project immediately came to an end, and the both of them lost their job. Shortly thereafter, they moved to a commune in Millbrook, New York. Basically, what they were doing is they were continuing their research outside of Harvard. They were inviting anybody who wanted to take on the psychedelic experience to their commune, where they themselves were taking high doses of LSD and giving it to anyone who wanted to participate. At this point, their identities changed. Leary became the high priest and sort of became the face of LSD from that point forward. And Richard Alpert ended up moving to India in search of spiritual growth, where he became Ram Dass, and he sort of became the face of beyond LSD, life beyond LSD. For Leary, this research needed to continue, and he decided to do it in his own way. At this point, LSD became lawless, and this was the beginning of the counterculture. When we look at the counterculture, there's a couple key figures to recognize. The first being Allen Ginsberg, who was the poet. Allen Ginsberg was a peaceful anarchist, and he was responsible for organizing many of the anti-war protests. He was also a personal friend of Leary. The two of them shared many psychedelic experiences together, and many of them are documented. Moving on, we have Hunter S. Thompson, or the journalist. Thompson was an all-American rebel, and he was a master journalist. He was the founder of gonzo journalism, a style of journalism in which the writer actually participates in what's going on, opposed to just reflecting on what's going on around them. Thompson was no stranger to madness. He actually provided us with what it was like to be inside the mind of an acid head during the counterculture of the late 60s. Moving on to John Lennon and the Beatles. Now, I would argue that the Beatles are a perfect representation of sort of the transition that happens before and after LSD. In the early 60s, we see them coming out with hits like She Loves You and Drive My Car and a lot more mainstream poppy things. And later, something happens, and then all of a sudden we see Lucy in the Sky with Diamond and Strawberry Fields Are Forever. What happened was that John Lennon and George Harrison went over to their dentist house for tea one afternoon, and the dentist administered them both LSD without telling them. But the two had, of course, this transformative experience, and we really see this reflected in, both their music, but also kind of where the band went from there. Unfortunately, as we know, the Beatles did split up, and John Lennon went on to pursue his solo career. At that time, he became a key figure in the counterculture peace movement, coming out with songs like Imagine and Instant Karma, We All Shine On, and a lot of other songs just promoting peace. Moving on to Ken Casey, or as people would call him, the Captain. Now, Casey and his gang of merry pranksters were the early pioneers in the LSD counterculture movement. In the early 60s, they hopped in their magic school bus and they drove across the United States, dosing themselves and anybody else they can get their hands on. Casey was also responsible for the infamous acid tests, what he claimed to be an attempt to bring humanity beyond LSD. Now, at the time, we know that Vietnam War was going on, and there was many young Americans being drafted and sent to die in Vietnam. And this obviously angered a lot of people. There was a lot of disease in the nation. The youth of America was really upset with their country and with their government. Now, you take this attitude and you bring in Timothy Leary, who's telling the young people to turn on, tune in, and drop out, which really resonated with them at the time. And what you get is 1967, the Summer of Love, which I would make the argument was, in fact, the greatest year in American history. What happened was in San Francisco, the hippie movement was really taking off, lots and lots of LSD along with other drugs, but really there was people were coming together in the name of peace and love and subjective expression. There was colors in the streets. It really was an amazing time. This really peaked in 1969 at Woodstock. This sort of embodied that whole culture, psychedelic era in general. And it was a big music show where really what was happening at Haight-Ashbury kind of moved over in upstate New York. They put on this music show. And really, though, it was sort of the end of this era. If you could think of the psychedelic era as being sort of a wave, Woodstock was really the peak of that time before the whole thing sort of crashed in on itself. So Woodstock does sort of represent the end of the 1960s in general and what this culture was about. However, the anti-war movement did move on into the 1970s. Now, when we're having the conversation of what makes an era great, we look at things, politically and socially, but I think it is equally important to look at the subjective expressions of the time, or rather the arts. And the late 60s was full of this. We see bands like the Grateful Dead coming out, who actually did start in Ken Casey's acid tests. They were playing for the band, they were playing for the parties, giving everyone some music. We see the Beatles, who, while of course they were popular prior to LSD, that experience with the dentist really birthed this new wave of experimental music that they were playing with. We see things like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club's Band and the Magic Mystery Tour. We see Jim Morrison in the Doors, which was kind of like, they sort of reflected the darker side of LSD. We see Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, and Pink Floyd. All these amazing artists and bands that were coming around this time, all of which were known for taking large amounts of LSD. Now, while we're talking about all the beautiful things that came out of this time, it is important also to recognize the cons that came with the psychedelic era. When a massive group of people take LSD irresponsibly, there will inevitably be negative side effects. Some of which being, of course, the bad trip, people having bad trips, people taking these things without really knowing what they are, freaking out, jumping out of windows or running into traffic. We see a lot of people running away from home, which ultimately was really destroying families. We see people moving on to harder drugs and overdosing, trying to chase that high that they initially got from some of the lighter drugs. We see people with pre-existing mental conditions getting worse after using LSD. Some examples of this would be Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys and Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd, both of which had pre-existing mental conditions, and they both heavily used LSD, making those conditions worse. Brian Wilson did end up getting help, but Syd Barrett, I don't believe, ever made it back, unfortunately. I believe personally, I would argue the biggest consequence that came from this point was that Leary never gave his followers any sort of guidance as to what to do after having the psychedelic experience. In other words, he taught everybody to drop out, but he never taught them how to land. Because of this, when the movement ended, there was a lot of people who were really lost, and Hunter S. Thompson actually reflects on this in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. In 1968, LSD was made illegal, and under the Nixon administration, it was marked as a Schedule 1 narcotic, alongside with psilocybin and mescaline. What this means is that they have zero medical value. Um, just to give some context, methamphetamine to this day is still a Schedule 2 narcotic because it is still prescribed to people. Now, because of this drug rating, LSD research came to a screaming halt, and these drugs would become known as street drugs for the decades to follow. Now, we need to understand that Leary's research did scare a lot of people. He was onto something big, and a lot of people weren't really ready for the drastic change that would occur after taking LSD. Also, in the way he did it was very forceful, and he was bringing about change in a way that was almost unproductive. But even with this said, we need to understand that while Leary's research did have negative consequences, we cannot deny the explosion of artistic expression, spiritual enlightenment, progressive thinking, and the overall cry for peace that was the late 1960s. While there were many other influences that aided in this transformative stage in American history, I would argue that LSD is the glue that really held it all together, as well as the vehicle that brought it all to the level of revolutionary. My hope of this research project is to help people understand what psychedelics are, understand the potential that they hold, and recognize that the 1960s would not have been the 1960s without LSD. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. Peace and love.